Here for you tonight are 5 stories that serve as warnings. A great-grandfather's last moments, caught in a letter. An uncle tells of his encounter with a beast at Honey Island. A park ranger's run-in with ghosts. Odd beings in Okefenokee. And a gator so large most would say it's impossible. These are tales on how the swamp can change you. So this story comes from my family, and I only found out about it a few years ago, when we were going through my grandmother's attic after she passed. We found this old letter, barely readable, dated November 1909. It was written by my great-grandfather, and after reading it, I understood why my family never talked about how he died. The letter was addressed to his brother but never sent. It was tucked inside a small wooden box, along with a few other personal effects that had been mailed back to the family by the local authorities in Florida. It contained a pocket watch, a photograph of my great-grandmother, and this letter that nobody in my family had ever read, still folded and water-stained. From what I could piece together, my great-grandfather was desperate for work and took a job with a man named Edgar Watson, who ran a sugarcane farm deep in the Everglades at a place called Chatham Bend. The pay was incredible for the time, $3 a day plus meals and a place to sleep, which should have been the first red flag. Most farms were paying $1 a day at most. My great-grandfather had left his family behind in Georgia, planning to work for a few months, save up money and send for them once he'd made enough. That was the plan anyway. He told them he was going to work on a farm in southern Florida and would write when he got settled in. In the letter, he described the journey down to Chatham Bend, how they traveled by boat for 2 full days, going deeper and deeper into the 10,000 islands. He wrote about how the water got darker, how the trees grew thicker, and how humanity seemed to fade away behind them. Watson was charming during the trip, he wrote, telling jokes and sharing whiskey, making everyone feel like they were heading to some kind of opportunity instead of into the middle of nowhere. When he talks about arriving at Watson's place, he mentions how impressive it looked. A real house, good equipment, and fertile land carved out of the wilderness. But he said the other workers seemed terrified of something. They barely spoke and wouldn't make eye contact with Watson. One of them was shaking during dinner that first night, and Watson joked that the man had malaria, but my grandfather didn't think that was the case. He describes the work in the letter: cutting sugarcane from dawn till dusk in the brutal Florida heat, mosquitoes so thick you'd breathe them in, the isolation of the place, how you could only see swamp in any direction. It was endless, he said. He mentions how Watson would sometimes disappear for hours at a time, taking his boat out deep into the marsh, and how the workers would go quiet whenever he left, like they were afraid to talk even when he wasn't there. My great-grandfather wrote that on his 3rd night there, one of the older workers pulled him aside after Watson had gone to bed. The man's name was Charlie, and he told my great-grandfather that 3 men had disappeared in the previous 2 weeks. Watson claimed they'd taken their pay and left on a supply boat in the middle of the night, but all their belongings were still in the bunkhouse along with their tools. Charlie then showed him a blood-stained shirt he'd found near the south dock, hidden under some coiled rope. The next morning, Charlie was gone. Watson said at breakfast that he'd run off in the night, claimed the man had gone mad from the heat and swamp fever. But the letter describes how my great-grandfather went to check Charlie's bunk and noticed his boots were under it. His bedroll was made up. His jacket was hanging on a nail. Everything was still there except for him. That's when my great-grandfather realized what was actually happening. Watson would hire drifters and workers who nobody would miss, or men like my great-grandfather who'd left their families behind and traveled alone. In other words, he hired vulnerable people who wouldn't be looked for, at least not for a while. He'd work them for weeks, and then when it came time to pay them, he'd kill them instead. The swamp was the perfect place to hide bodies. The alligators and the elements would take care of the evidence. It would be just another worker who moved on, or another man that couldn't take care of his family so he abandoned them. At least that's what the ones back home would think. The letter gets frantic toward the end. The handwriting becomes harder to read, like he was writing fast, or his hand was shaking. He writes about planning to escape that night. He was going to steal one of the small boats and go north until he hit a town. It would have to be done in complete darkness, navigating by the stars, and he hoped he wouldn't get lost in the maze of channels and islands. He wrote that he was leaving the letter hidden in the bottom of his trunk, so if anything happened, there'd be some record of the truth. Someone would know what happened at Chatham Bend. The letter ends mid-sentence. He's writing about hearing footsteps outside the bunkhouse, and then it stops. The pen trails off the edge of the page. My family always said he died in a work accident in Florida, that there'd been an incident at a farm and his body was never recovered. But now I know the truth. He's probably still out there somewhere in that swamp, along with all the other workers Watson killed. I looked into Edgar Watson and found out he really existed. He operated that farm for nearly 20 years. Estimates say he may have killed over 50 people, though the real number could be much higher. In 1910, a group of locals finally confronted him at a place called Smallwood Store and shot him dead. They shot him 33 times because they were terrified he wouldn't stay down. The authorities never made a serious investigation of his property. The swamp was too thick and dangerous. It would have taken weeks to search even a fraction of that area around Chatham Bend, and who knew what they'd find in that dark water. To this day, nobody knows exactly how many victims are still out there in the Everglades. My great-grandfather is just one name on a very long list of people who went to Chatham Bend and never came back. I've been to the Everglades twice since finding that letter. There's not much left of Watson's farm now, only some old foundations and fields being slowly taken over by the swamp. But I swear, standing there, you can feel something evil about the place. It's like the land itself remembers what went on. Sometimes I imagine what happened in those last moments, about my great-grandfather writing frantically in the darkness, knowing he was in danger, and trying to leave some trace of himself behind. I can see him, scared in his bunk, rushing to put the letter in his trunk seconds before being grabbed. I wonder if Edgar Watson went through his stuff, or if he just had it thrown into storage. Somehow it made it back to my family. I don't blame them for not reading the letter. It would have been too much to take in back then. My great-grandma probably knew the truth after the news about the place came out, and wanted to remember my great-grandpa in happier times. Now that I've read it, at least someone has confirmation about what happened to him. My Uncle Billy lived in Louisiana his whole life, and he was an experienced outdoorsman. He'd been hunting and fishing in the swamps around New Orleans since he was a kid. Grew up doing it with his dad and grandpa. He wasn't the type of person to make up stories or get scared easily. In 40 years of going into those swamps, he'd dealt with alligators, water moccasins, wild hogs, you name it. Nothing fazed him. So when he told me about what happened to him in Honey Island Swamp in the summer of 2003, I believed every word. He'd gone out there with his friend Jeff to do some fishing. They'd heard about a spot deep in the swamp where the catfish got huge. Some locals had told them about it at a bait shop in Slidell. They figured they'd spend the weekend camping and seeing what they could catch. They took Jeff's boat about 2 hours into the swamp, following channels and tributaries until they found this isolated spot that looked perfect. My uncle said they didn't see another soul once they got about an hour in, It was just them in the wilderness. The fishing was great the first day. They caught more fish than they could eat and spent the evening around their campfire, drinking beer and telling stories. My uncle said the only weird thing was the smell. There was this awful rotting odor that would drift through the camp every hour or so. It wasn't constant. It would come and go with the breeze. They figured it was a dead alligator or a deer that had drowned somewhere nearby. Happens all the time in the swamp. Animals die, they decompose, and the smell carries. They didn't think much of it. Around midnight, they heard something out in the water. It sounded like something big pushing through the shallows near their camp, and they could hear the water sloshing with each step. They shined their flashlights toward the sound but couldn't see anything beyond the thick brush and cypress knees. Whatever it was stopped moving when the lights hit the water. They waited for maybe 5 minutes, listening, but there was complete silence except for the normal night sounds of the swamp. They convinced themselves it was probably just a bear or a large gator and trying to get some sleep. But my uncle said he kept waking up throughout the night with this overwhelming feeling that something was watching them from the darkness. He said Jeff later admitted he'd felt the same thing, but neither of them wanted to say anything that night because they didn't want to seem paranoid. When the sun came up, they found tracks around their campsite. My uncle described them as being about 14 inches long, with 3 webbed toes and deep claw marks at the end of each toe. They formed a complete circle around where they'd been sleeping, like whatever made them had been pacing around the tent all night. The tracks were pressed deep into the mud, suggesting whatever made them was heavy. My uncle said he'd seen bear tracks, gator tracks, and hog tracks his whole life. None of them matched up to what he was looking at. Jeff wanted to leave right then, but my uncle was curious. He'd never seen tracks like that before, and he wanted to figure out what animal they belonged to. Looking back, he said that he was probably stupid, but in the moment, his curiosity overrode his common sense. They followed the tracks away from camp, through the shallow water, and into an overgrown area where the cypress trees grew so thick you could barely see the sky. That's when they found the clearing. There were 4 dead wild boars lying in a rough circle, all of them with their throats torn out. These weren't small pigs either. My uncle said they were probably 200 pounds each. The ground around them was covered in those same 3-toed tracks. But what really disturbed my uncle was the way the boars were positioned. They weren't scattered like they'd been hunted or killed by a wild animal. They were arranged in an order, almost like an offering or a ritual. And the smell, that same rotting smell from the night before, was overwhelming in that clearing. My uncle said it smelled like decay mixed with something animal and feral that he couldn't place. It made his eyes water. Jeff started gagging and had to step back. They heard a sound then, coming from deeper in the swamp. It was this low, guttural vocalization that my uncle said didn't sound like any animal he knew of. It was almost like a growl mixed with something that could have been speech, if something that wasn't human was trying to form words. The sound made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. They ran back to their camp, grabbed their gear, and got in the boat. They didn't even pack properly, just threw everything in and started the engine. As they were pulling away, my uncle looked back at the shoreline and saw something standing in the shadows between the trees. He only saw it for a second before Jeff gunned the engine and they sped away, but he described it as being at least 7 feet tall, covered in grayish hair, with these yellow eyes that reflected the morning light. It was standing upright like a man, but the arms were too long and the shoulders too broad. My uncle reported what they found to the wildlife authorities, and they told him it was probably just a bear, or a large feral hog that had gotten aggressive with some of the other animals. They didn't seem interested in looking into it any further. But my uncle knew this was something else entirely. Bears don't arrange their kills in circles. Bears don't make sounds like that. He never went back to Honey Island Swamp. He wouldn't even talk about it for years afterward. He'd changed the subject whenever anyone brought up that area. It was only about 6 months before he died from cancer that he finally told me the whole story. I think he knew he didn't have much time left and wanted someone to know what really happened out there. He said he'd spent 20 years trying to forget what he'd seen that morning, but he never could. And he was grateful every day that it had let them go. He said he got the distinct impression that morning that they were being allowed to leave. That whatever it was could have stopped them if it wanted to. That's what haunted him most. The idea that he'd been at its mercy the entire time and didn't even know it. I'm a park ranger, and what I'm about to tell you happened in 2018 at the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge on the border of Virginia and North Carolina. I've worked at various parks for 15 years, and I've seen some strange things. Bears acting territorial, lost hikers in bad shape, even what I'm pretty sure was a mountain lion once, even though they're not supposed to be in that area. But nothing prepared me for what happened that day. It was late October, and I was doing a routine patrol of the Washington Ditch Trail. This is a popular trail, especially in late fall when the leaves are changing, but by late afternoon most visitors have already headed back to their cars. It was around 4:30, maybe 5 o'clock, and the sun was starting to get low. I was about 3 miles in when I saw 2 people walking toward me on the trail. The first thing that stood out was their clothing. The man was wearing what looked like colonial-era clothes, a long coat, breeches, and a 3-corner hat. The woman was in a long dress with a bonnet, the kind you see in those old paintings. My first thought was that they were probably reenactors from one of those local historical sites, or one of the plantation museums. Then I thought maybe they were taking some photos or doing research for a documentary or something. But as they got closer, I got this weird feeling. They weren't talking to each other or looking around at the scenery. Most people on the trail are pointing out birds or trees, taking pictures and enjoying nature. These 2 were just walking strangely, staring straight ahead like they were focused on some place only they could see. What struck me as funny was I couldn't hear their footsteps. The trail was covered in fallen leaves and branches. When I walked, every step made noise from the crunching of leaves. But these 2 were completely silent. I called out to them when they were maybe 20 yards away. "Excuse me, folks, park's closing soon. You'll want to start heading back to the parking area." They didn't respond. They didn't even acknowledge me. They just kept walking, their expressions blank, and their eyes focused on something in the distance. It was like I wasn't even there. I stepped to the side of the trail to let them pass, figuring maybe they were deaf or didn't speak English. And that's when I felt it. The temperature dropped what must have been 20 degrees in just a few seconds. My breath came out in visible clouds. In Virginia, in October, when it had been a comfortable 75 degrees just moments before. As they passed me, maybe 3 feet away, I got a clear look at their faces. Their skin had this weird waxy quality to it, almost like candle wax or like those old wax museum figures. And their eyes gave me the impression that the lights were on but no one was home. It was like looking at a photograph instead of a person. The woman's eyes were this pale blue color. Instead of life, they were just flat and empty. I turned to watch them continue down the trail behind me, and I kid you not, I looked away for maybe 2 seconds to check my radio, to call this in because it was so bizarre. And when I looked back, they were gone. The trail was empty in both directions, and there was nowhere they could have gone. The swamp on either side was thick with brush and black water. Nobody could have moved through that silently and quickly enough to disappear in 2 seconds. It's physically impossible. I radioed back to the station and told them what I'd seen. My supervisor, Frank, asked if I was feeling all right, suggested maybe I was dehydrated or had been out in the sun too long. He wasn't being dismissive exactly, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. Then I remembered the stories about the Lady of the Lake. Someone had told me about it years ago when I first started. The story goes something like, in the 1700s, a young woman's fiancé went hunting in the Great Dismal Swamp for their wedding feast, and he never returned. She went searching for him, and both of them disappeared into the swamp. According to the legend, their ghosts still walk the area, eternally searching for a way home they'll never find. I talked to some of the older rangers, and one of them, a guy named Tom who'd been working there for 30 years, told me he'd heard the story in different ways over his career. Hikers occasionally report a couple in old-fashioned clothing on that trail, always walking in the same direction, silent, and disappearing when people try to talk to them. Tom said it happened maybe once or twice a year, different people reporting the same thing. He'd never seen them himself, but he believed the people who had. About a week after my encounter, I was reviewing some trail camera footage from that area. We have cameras set up to monitor wildlife activity, track deer populations, that kind of thing. I found footage from the day I saw that couple, from a camera positioned about 100 yards past where I ran into them, right on the trail where they should have walked. In the footage, you can see me walking past the camera, clear as day, but when I reviewed the timestamp for when that couple should have walked by, just a few minutes before I did, the trail's empty, only trees and leaves and shadows. The camera didn't pick them up at all. I still work at Great Dismal Swamp, but I make sure I'm off that trail before sunset. I don't do late patrols on Washington Ditch anymore if I can help it. And if I ever see that couple again, I'm not stopping to talk to them. They're trapped in their own story, walking the same path over and over. And I don't want to do anything that would make me a part of that story. This happened 5 years ago when my friends and I decided to go on a 3-day camping and kayaking trip through the Okefenokee swamp in Georgia. We'd all been camping before, but we wanted to do something more, something off the beaten path. The Okefenokee seemed perfect, this massive wilderness where you could paddle for days and barely see anyone else. We should have paid more attention to what the locals told us when we stopped in Folkestone to get supplies. The guy at the outfitter shop kept asking if we were sure about going that deep into the swamp. He mentioned that people sometimes experience weird things out there, that the Okefenokee can mess with your head if you're not careful. We laughed it off. We were young and confident, and figured he was the weird local who had one too many shots of moonshine. We loaded up our kayaks and headed into the swamp. The first day was incredible. The scenery was like nothing I'd ever seen. Ancient cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, chocolate water that reflected the sky like a mirror, along with alligators sunning themselves on logs. We made camp on one of the designated platforms and spent the evening watching the sunset over the marsh. That night, the ground started shaking. I don't mean like an earthquake, but this constant subtle motion that made the entire platform feel unstable. My friend Jake said it was probably the peat deposit shifting, and that it was normal in the Okefenokee. The Native Americans called it the land of trembling earth for a reason. But it didn't feel normal. It felt like the swamp was alive and breathing beneath us. The second day is when things got weird. We were paddling through a narrow channel, following our GPS route, when we noticed the trees around us looked dead. Their bark was black and their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The water changed color too, from the normal black tea tint to something that almost looked oily, with strange rainbow shimmers on the surface. Then we saw the lights. It was mid-afternoon, full daylight, but there were these glowing orbs floating between the trees about 50 yards to our left. They were moving in patterns, almost like they were searching for something. We stopped paddling and watched them for what must have been 10 minutes. They dart between the trees, cluster together, then separate again. My friend Rachel pulled out her phone to record them, but as soon as she raised the camera, the lights vanished, like someone had flipped a switch. We figured they must have been some kind of swamp gas or methane bubbles igniting. We kept paddling, but the GPS started acting up. It would show us in one location, then suddenly jump to somewhere completely different. We'd be on one course 1 minute, then according to the GPS, we'd be 2 miles off the trail. We tried using our paper maps, but the landmarks didn't match up. Channels that should have been there weren't, and we kept finding waterways that weren't on any map. By the time the sun started going down, we were completely lost. We had no idea where we were or how to get back. We found another camping platform and made camp, trying not to panic. That's when we heard the sounds. It started just after dark, this low humming noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It would rise and fall in pitch, almost like machinery, but there was nothing out there except the swamp. Then we heard what sounded like voices, but they were speaking in a language none of us recognized. The words were all wrong, the syllables too long and intonation strange. We huddled on the platform with our flashlights, watching the darkness around us. And that's when we saw them. Figures moving through the trees. They were tall, at least 8 or 9 feet, and they moved in this jerky way that kind of made me nauseous. They were gliding, floating just above the water without disturbing it. There were 4 of them from what we could see, and they were circling our platform, getting closer with each pass. We couldn't make out any details, only these dark silhouettes against the slightly less dark swamp. But we could feel them watching us. Jake pointed his flashlight directly at one of them, and for just a second, we saw it clearly. I can't even describe what we saw because it seemed unnatural. There's no creature I can think of that would compare to it. The image is burned into my memory, but every time I try to remember the specifics, my mind just slides off of it like trying to grab smoke. We spent the entire night like that, huddled together, watching these things circle us. They never came onto the campsite, but they never left either. They simply circled and watched, and occasionally made those horrible sounds that might have been speech. When the sun came up, they were gone. They left with the darkness. Our GPS started working again, showing us exactly where we were and how to get out. We packed up and paddled as fast as we could toward the exit. It took us 6 hours of nonstop paddling to get back. When we got to the outfitter shop to return our gear, the same guy who'd warned us was working. He took one look at us and just nodded. He didn't ask what happened. He just said, "The swamp showed you something, didn't it?" There's something in that swamp. Something that's been there long before humans arrived, and will be there long after we're gone. I don't know what it is. I don't want to know. I'm just grateful it decided to let us go. I've lived in Louisiana my entire life. I've seen gators in my backyard, in the canals, and sunning themselves on the banks of every bayou from here to the Gulf. Most people are afraid of them, but if you grew up here, you learn to respect them like you respect a power tool. They're dangerous, sure, if you're stupid, but otherwise they're just a part of the scenery. Or at least that's what I thought until 3 years ago. It was a Saturday in late July, and the kind of night where the humidity is so thick, you feel like you're breathing through a wet cloth. My friend Tyler and I decided to go out for some night fishing. We were in a 17-foot aluminum tracker, heading deep into the Henderson Swamp. We wanted to get away from the noise of the landing, so we drifted back into a series of oil cuts. By midnight, we were tucked into a small dead-end cove. The water was like black glass. We had a single lantern hanging off the side and our headlamps, but everything else around us was total darkness. "You hear that?" Tyler asked. He had his line in the water, but he was looking toward the trees. I listened. The usual swamp sounds were there, the cicadas, the bullfrogs, and the occasional splash of water. But then, I heard what he was talking about. There was a slow, heavy slosh of water against the bank, like a large boat had just passed by, except we never heard an engine. "Probably a beaver," I said. I clicked on my spotlight and scanned the bank. The beam cut through the dark, reflecting off the gray trunks of the cypress trees. I saw a few pairs of small orange eyes reflecting back, young gators, maybe 4 or 5 feet long. Nothing unusual. Then, about 50 yards away, my light hit something that didn't make sense. I thought it was a downed log. It was dark, jagged, and stretched out along the surface of the water. But as my beam settled on it, I realized the log had skin. It looked like wet, black armor. I followed the length of it with the light. I moved the beam 5 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet. The log ended in a massive, broad snout that was resting on a floating mat of weeds. The eyes weren't orange like the small ones. They were a deep, glowing crimson, and they were the size of softballs. "Tyler," I breathed, "don't move." Tyler turned his headlamp toward where I was pointing. I could hear him swallow. That can't be real. That's gotta be fake." It wasn't fake. We watched as the creature exhaled. A low, vibrating hiss came from the bank. The water around the gator's back began to dance, the vibrations causing tiny droplets to jump off the surface. In Louisiana, the record for an alligator is around 14 feet. This thing made a 14-footer look like a lizard. From tip of its snout to where its tail disappeared into the black water, it had to be 20, maybe even 25 feet long. It looked prehistoric. Then it slipped into the water. Oh, fuck, I thought. We couldn't see where it went. "Start the engine," I said. Tyler reached for the pull start on the outboard. He gave it a rip. The engine didn't start. The swamp went dead silent. The bullfrog stopped. The only sound was the lap of the ripples hitting the side of our boat. He gave it another pull. The engine sputtered, then died. "Tyler, get us moving," I whispered. I shone the light directly over the side. The water was murky, but the gator was so large I could see the outline of it passing directly under our boat. It felt like a submarine was beneath us. The boat rose up slightly as the creature's back brushed up against the hull. Suddenly, the gator's head broke the surface 3 feet from the transom. It didn't attack. It simply stayed there, its massive head nearly as wide as the back of the boat. The smell was the worst part. The stench of rotting fish and stagnant mud, so thick it made my eyes water. Tyler gave the cord one last desperate pull. The engine roared to life, propeller churning the amber water into a white froth. In that split second, the gator reacted. It thrashed its tail in a single violent move to dive away from the noise. The force of the water hitting the boat was enough to send us rolling. Tyler slammed the throttle into gear and we lurched forward, the bow of the boat jumping as we sped out of the cove. We didn't look back until we hit the main channel. When we got the boat onto the trailer and under the lights of the parking lot, we both got out to look at the hull. There along the bottom of the aluminum were scratches in the metal where the back of that thing had scraped us. Most people would say that what we saw was impossible, that a gator that big couldn't find enough food to live out there, or they just don't grow that big anymore. Some of the old-timers tell me I must have seen two gators swimming close together, but I got a clear view of its head, so I know that ain't correct. I still go out on the water, but I don't fish at night anymore. And I never, ever go back into those oil cuts. Because I know that down there, in the dark and the silt, are things that people haven't seen yet.
You have been watching Noir, a Radion production brought to you by Trapper Dan, the finest in canned survival food.